Hey, welcome back to this series where we are learning how to integrate AI products into our web application projects. In this video, we are going to be focusing on using AI to generate images, but we're also going to be focusing on just building out some interesting stuff in Qwik and having a good time building some components. So if that sounds good to you, let's get into it. Okay, so one thing that I want to work on next is basically having some sort of button that kind of opens up a dialog component to show an image of the two opponents sort of fighting. It's just going to be a silly little thing that we're going to work on, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun and gives us a good opportunity to dive into some of the more Qwik specific things, and then a little bit of playing with image generation using OpenAI. So for this dialog, I think what I'm going to do, just because I know that this is going to be a component I might use more than once, I'm going to copy and paste that and just create a new component called dialog. And then we'll do the same little song and dance here. There we go. And rename that dialog. Cool. Now, yeah, we'll leave that there for now. I'm going to import it here. Bring in the dialog. We'll grab that. And I'm going to put it down sort of at the bottom of the page after the text where we're spitting out the content there. So we're going to do the dialog component, and let's just start with that. It's complaining because it thinks it's an input. So let's play around with this. Just confirm that it's working. Yep, we have an input component. Okay, we know that our dialog component is working. Now let's fix up a couple of the basic things. I'm going to have a div. We're going to have a dialog here. Let's just say dialog for now. I am going to fix up some of these type definitions really quick. We are going to have HTML attributes, but this is going to be the HTML dialog element. Yeah, okay, no suggestions, but you know what it is. That's fine. Thank you. And then we're going to call this dialog attributes. Going to use that inside of the component props so that it will basically inherit from the dialog attributes. You can pass it on to the dialog element. This stuff we will just get rid of for now. I may use it in a moment. And then that is not yet very useful. So let's start with that. Let's see, there it is. There's our dialog component. Now I'm going to be using an actual dialog component, so might as well put it in there. And let's start with, yeah, a to-do. Thanks, VS Code. No, let's start by getting, why not let's get the content working in here. So I want some dynamic content to be able to sit inside of this dialog. Let's just look at this in case you're not familiar with the dialog component or dialog HTML element. We can see, let's see, somewhere in there, where is it? Down here, I suppose. Yeah, there's the dialog element, but we can't actually see anything. And that's because by default, they aren't actually visible. So we can give it this open prop to see that it's on the page, and then we can see it's on there. Now, this version of the dialog, I don't actually love. This is something that you can have, but I think I want to be able to programmatically open it, and then we'll see it behave slightly differently. But the important thing is, we can leave that open. The important thing is I want this content to be dynamic from wherever it's used. So let's actually leave that how it was. There we go. And let's say dialog content should exist. So we'll leave that. And then the question is, where's the content? So with Qwik, like some other frameworks like Vue and Svelte, we have access to a slot component. You can see that that got imported there. And just by putting the slot in there, we can see that now we have the dialog content being passed in from the parent onto this element. Great. That's the first problem solved. Next, as I mentioned, I don't love this API for opening up a dialog. Would like to have some sort of button instead. So let's start by building out a button. That's just going to be, I don't know, we'll say toggle dialog. We'll start with that. So if we start with that, we can see now we've replaced the dialog on the page. We have this button. It doesn't actually currently do anything. And what I wanted to do is essentially toggle the state of the dialog. Now, this gets a little bit of a mix between having event handlers in Qwik that correspond to DOM methods on the dialog element. So we essentially are going to want to have some sort of reactive state that knows the state of the dialog, whether it's open. We'll have an event handler where the button, when it's clicked, can toggle that state. And then we need to actually have access to the DOM node for the dialog in order to trigger some of the methods on it. So what I'm going to do is start with probably a state. So const state equals, and we have use store that we bring in from Qwik again. I'm going to instantiate that as an object, and we're going to say, yeah, sure, open is false. So it's going to start off closed, and I actually don't love open. I like is open because open sounds like it could be a method as well. So is open or is closed or whatever. Next, in order to have access to the actual DOM node, we can probably do some document query selector sort of work, but Qwik does give us access to refs if you're familiar with other libraries. So like React or Vue or Solid, we can say const dialog ref is going to be, and that's essentially going to be a signal. So we're going to use a signal that's also going to come in from Qwik. And in order to associate the ref on the node, the DOM node, we just say ref equals, and we'll pass in curly braces the dialog ref. Great. So I think actually I probably don't need this state just yet. I think we just need the ref and then an event listener on this button that's going to trigger the show dialog method on the DOM node. So what we're going to do is add a click event listener on click there, and that's going to reference, we'll have it be a method called show. So this needs to be defined. We're going to say const show equals, and then if you remember the Qwik sort of syntax for adding event handlers, we have to use this sort of $ parentheses. So that should also come in from Qwik. I'm going to put it, where do I want it? We'll just put it there. I don't know. I'm weird about that. But what we want this to do is be an event listener. I don't think we need actually access to the event object. We're just going to have a function that's going to run, and we're going to grab the dialog DOM node from the dialog ref.value. Now we need to use this .value syntax because we are using a signal. So there is the possibility that the dialog is not defined. So if it's not there, we'll just return early. I don't know when the case might be, but it is possible before this component renders that ref is not defined and therefore possibly not accessed or not available in the DOM. So we'll just put that as a safety check. And then we can do something like dialog dot. And the method we want to target is show modal. So that should open up the dialog element. So I think if we come back here and we click that, there it is. That's my modal, very nice. And then how do we close it? We click everywhere, we can hit escape. So escape can close it, but I really like being able to click on the outside of the dialog here and also having a way to close it that way and not just rely on the escape key. This is another one of those sort of built-in APIs that doesn't quite exist, so we're going to be doing a little bit more work to build it in ourselves. Fortunately, that's pretty easy to do because we can just add a click event listener on the dialog itself. So we're going to say on click, there we go, and we'll do handle dialog click, dialog click, something like that. So we'll have another method or function here called const handle dialog click. This is going to be another one of these funny Qwik event handlers. There we go. And we'll put the function in there. Now this time we will need access to the event because we want to see which element was clicked. So we're going to say, essentially, we only want to fire well, let's see. What we want to do is say sort of this same logic here. Copy it, paste it here, and then we'll say dialog.close. And let's just start with that. Let's see what we got. We open it, and we close it. Great, we open it. And now the problem here is if I click here, we also close, we don't want to close it if we click inside of the dialog element. So what we can do is essentially here say console log the event.target.local name. Let's just start with that. And look at my console. What happens if I click in here? We get the dialog. And what happens if I click out here? We get the dialog. Oh, what happens if I click? That's weird. Oh, right. That's because we have the contents of the dialog directly here. So I think what we're going to do is add a div that's going to be responsible to just receive the clicks. It's not really doing a whole lot. It's just kind of the contents of the dialog. I think it also is going to serve just to have a little bit of padding in there anyway. So we're going to say P2. So let's see where we are here. We show it. Looks a little bit better. And now if I click on here, we can see that now we're clicking a div. So anywhere inside of here is the div, and anywhere outside of there is the dialog. So that makes it a little bit easier to decipher which element was actually clicked. And we can essentially say something like, if the event target local name triple equals dialog, or if it doesn't equal dialog, then we can just return out of this handler early. Otherwise, we can go forward with closing it, right? So we do this, we open it, we can click everywhere in here just fine. And then if we click outside, we close it. Great. Now, because we have an element that's a button that's controlling the visibility of another element, we probably want to add some sort of accessibility features to it, including ARIA controls or ARIA attributes. So we're going to say ARIA controls, and this is going to tell us which element this button is going to have control over, and we want to associate it with this dialog. So we are going to need an ID, so I'm glad I didn't delete that. We will need access to an ID, which we can pull off of the props if it exists. If it doesn't exist, we'll just generate a random one, that's fine. And then we'll use this to associate this to the this button to this dialog. It's getting a little bit hairy, so let's move that onto multiple lines. There we go. And we'll say the ID equals the ID. Now those are associated. And now we probably also want to have some sort of logic that tells this button or anyone interacting with it, not just what element it controls, but whether that element is open or not. So we can do that with ARIA expanded, which expects a Boolean. Now, here's where we want to actually have access to something like a state, because we want to know whether this is open or not. So I'm going to go back and uncomment this so that we have some sort of state. And then we're going to say ARIA expanded basically just maps directly to state.isOpen. If it is open, it is expanded. If it is not open, it is not expanded. So now the question becomes, how do we manage tracking this is open state? And we could say on show, we always want to set that to true, but then we also want some sort of handler that maybe hides it. And I'm also noticing that we have like a lot of repeated code here. So I think what I actually want to do is sort of inverse some logic and essentially just have one way of tracking is open and then having some functions that respond or react to the change in this state. And the way we do that in Qwik, if you're familiar with something like React, it's going to be something like useEffect, or maybe you're familiar with Vue with a watcher. With Qwik, we have something called tasks. So what I'm going to do is I think I'll put the ref up here. Oops. Oh, what did I do? There we go. Ref up there, and then the state, and I think that looks a little bit cleaner to me. So then what we can do is say use task, and that's coming in from Qwik. So we're going to use a task. That's going to expect a function, and this is going to run some sort of logic. So essentially what I want to do is just check on the status of is open and then call both of these accordingly. So we can say something like, if state dot is open, then we'll do the open logic. Otherwise, There we go. Otherwise, we'll do the close logic. So the open logic is here, right? Okay. The close logic is here. Now we need access to this, so we can take this and just put it up there. So it's the same. And that makes it easier to handle showing or hiding this, because now all we have to do is set state.isOpen equals, I think, what did we say? False here. So that's going to be closing it. And inside of show, we actually can kind of simplify this. We probably don't even need this function anymore, because all we have to do is pass in a function into this event handler that sets sets state.isOpen to true. So that simplifies both the open and close logic. I think this works better for me. And then we just have a little bit of some logic to go here. So we do have to do this custom event handler for the click. Let's see how we're working. Not very well. And I think I know why. So the problem is, or essentially we got everything right. There's just one other thing that I was missing. And that is that in order for the actual sort of watching to happen, let's see what happens. I'm gonna console log task here. And then just so we can see what's going on, somewhere here, I'm gonna put the state.isOpen, and then we'll see the value of that. So we're not actually seeing it. What am I missing? We'll turn that into a string. Is that gonna work? Whoops. There we go. Okay, so we can see that we are actually toggling it correctly. So we are setting the state to true, but we're not getting the show modal to actually run because it's not reactively responding to that change. And the reason is because Qwik is not going to automatically know to watch this sort of value. So to do that, we have a parameter here that has some options on it, including track. And we essentially have to tell Qwik what we need to track in order to watch this logic. So I'm just going to put it in here. We're going to say track. That expects a function that is going to return the value you want to track. In our case, we want to track state.isOpen. And I think now, because we are watching this closely, it will run this function anytime this gets updated. Hopefully I got that right this time. Hey, there we go. Okay, that opened it, and then we click out here and that closed it, and it looks like, yep, works with the click. However, it does not work when you press escape to open this up again. And there is a reason for that. It's kind of weird, but it has to do with the HTML dialog element. And the issue is that when we click escape on this dialog, Qwik has no idea that we essentially have done anything different. So the escape key is not going to know how to update isOpen here, which means that it's going to remain true despite the fact that the dialog closes. So there's a very simple fix here is we can basically add another event listener to that close event and say on close equals, and then we essentially want to do the same thing that we have here, is just set our state to isOpen of false. I think that should do it. So now we click that, we open, we hit escape key, we close, we click it again, and it's working. Perfect. We can hit escape key or we can click on the outside, and now our state is tracking based on the dialogs API. Okay, we're nearly done with the design of this component. A couple things I need to adjust here. First, we probably don't want toggle to be here. We probably want some sort of text. I imagine we don't necessarily always want to provide a default value. So I'm going to have some sort of prop that expects what you want to call the toggle. So we're going to just call this actually toggle, and this is going to be a prop that we bring in. Now, if you remember how we did in the input, we kind of just received props, and then we had this spread thing here that ended up putting some unnecessary props on the text area, and I invited you to try and solve that. I'm going to show you one way that I solved it here is we're going to use destructuring. And essentially everything that we don't explicitly define, we're going to pass in as props. And then we're going to spread that onto the target that we want. So all of everything that is not an explicit prop, we'll just assume is an HTML attribute for the dialog, and that will be captured here, which I guess we could call it attributes or something. But we want to have a prop called toggle, which we do not want captured inside of props. So we'll pull it out here by destructuring, and then we'll have access to it. And now we have this little squiggly because we don't know what toggle is. So I'm going to provide some type definition here for toggle, and I want that to be a string. Now, if we go back to our implementation, we see the little red squiggly here because we're missing something here, and it's saying, hey, I would really like a toggle, please. So what do I want this to say? Let's say something like show me, because eventually this is going to show the image that's going to go in here for the battle. So show me, okay, still working, great. Next, if you remember, there is this open prop that we want to be able to provide, right? We want to support all of the default values on the HTML dialog. I don't know why that's complaining, because that should be dialog attribute, but that should exist. So if I look here, yeah, we can see that the dialog is in fact open. It doesn't have that background because that's how the native dialog component works if you use the open attribute as opposed to explicitly or programmatically opening it using show modal. Kind of weird. I don't understand why that's the case, but that is the case. And the other weird thing is once it's open, you don't have access to closing it with the keyboard or with the mouse or the keyboard. So I really don't love that. So I actually prefer removing that as an option. So where is it? Here we go. I want to basically prevent someone from using the default open attribute, but I want to support that API. So if someone is familiar with the dialog, they should still be able to pass this and it should work as expected, except not quite with this version. So what I'm going to do is essentially hijack this attribute. I'm going to steal it off of the props here. So we're going to say, yes, you can pass open. And it's going to be an optional property. And it's going to be a Boolean. Boolean. So now the tricky thing is, how do we ensure that this open prop actually updates the state of the dialog? Well, this is also kind of tricky, partly because Qwik supports server-side rendering. There is no such thing as an open dialog on the server side. That is something that can only happen once the HTML is in the browser, and then we want it to open. So what we're going to do here is, rather than supporting open attributes on the dialog element, what we'll do is essentially wait for this component to mount on the client side only, and then we'll check if that property is defined and if it's true. And if it is, then we'll update our state, which should trigger this flow, this tracker or this task, which should trigger this flow and essentially show or hide the dialog component or element. So to do that, we have something similar to use task, which is, watching for changes on things, except if you're familiar with other UI frameworks, you might be familiar with like mounted hooks. Qwik has something similar, but named slightly different, and that is use visible task. And the reason why we need to be explicit about whether it's visible is because some of these things, these tasks and these trackers and effects, they can actually run on the server side as well. And we want to only run this when the element is on the page. So we'll use a visible task, which works essentially the same as the regular task, where we can essentially just say state.isOpen is going to be equal to the open prop. And that's going to complain because it could be undefined. So if it's not defined, then we'll set it to false. So let's look at our page. And sure enough, we have it working now. If I reload, the page loads and then the dialog opens because we have defined it in our parent to be open. Cool, great. Okay, now there's just a couple more things I want to support in this dialog component. It's not super important for the API stuff or the AI stuff, but I think it's cool to just build this stuff out. And that is, what if I wanted to make this open prop somehow controllable from this parent? So it can be either programmatically opened or closed from this component. So what I'm going to do is actually, maybe we'll have another button here. That's like toggle dialog or something. And then we'll set this to some sort of dialog state dot is open. And then we need to define this. And just since I'm here, I'm going to say on click, we're going to have a function that sets dialog state dot is open to whatever the opposite is. State dot is open. Okay, now let's define that. Come down here. I'm going to say const dialog state equals use store, and then is open is false. Okay, let's see if we can programmatically trigger this. Let's see, I think that's actually controls the dialog. And then I want this one to also be able to control the dialog. So the problem here is that once again, we are passing in this open attribute, but we're trying to control it from the parent. So I want something that essentially watches that open attribute as it changes and then updates the state as well. And so once again, this makes sense for a task. I don't think we need to use visible task because that's not going to need to run on the server differently than on the client. So I think what we can actually do is just use a task once again, and we're going to essentially check as open changes, or I guess we'll essentially do this as well. We're gonna do this, do that, and then we want to also track the state of open, right? So we're gonna say track, track, and have a function that returns open. So that's going to make sure that we're tracking this open prop as it changes. Hey, so I just want to jump in and make a quick correction here because I accidentally overcomplicated this thing by using a use visible task and a use task for effectively the same piece of state. So we could just accomplish the same effect as having both of these by including this tracker inside of this use visible task. So we can actually just copy this and effectively replace this. So we bring the tracker in and we track open, which means we no longer need this use task, and we can simplify our code by just having this one use visible task. So if I got that right, let's hope. Yeah, very cool. Okay, now there's a little problem here, and that is just the communication between the child component talking to the parent. Clicking toggle dialog, whoa, let's reload. In the parent, well, first off, let's see if we can provide a way to hide this button, because if we want to do programmatic control from the parent, we probably don't also want the button there. So what we'll do is say that this toggle can either be a string or it can be false. And then we can essentially just show or hide it, whether it's true or false. So we can say if toggle and show the JSX. So if it's not defined, we'll hide it. And then in our parent, we're going to say toggle, we actually want to be false. Okay, we have successfully hid it. And now we'll see that there's this weird communication flaw between the parent here programmatically enabling the dialog and then the dialog triggering some sort of close, but not updating the parent. So according to the parent, the parent still thinks the dialog's open. So if I click it again, it will toggle that state to false. And then if I click it one more time, it'll toggle it to true, which reopens the dialog. So what we probably want to do is launch some sort of events on the dialog component itself so that the parent can tap into it and understand, hey, this thing has closed, okay? So probably want to do something about that. So these event handlers from Qwik, essentially, they behave different than most of the other frameworks that I've worked on, where you don't have some sort of event system. You basically just have a callback system. So because this is a custom component, we can do something like on close, $, and then equals, and then we pass in the handler that we want. So we're just going to say, when it closes, we're going to set dialog state dot is open to false, right? That's the logic that we want to capture. That is the handler or the callback function that we want to execute on close. And I think it's kind of as simple as just providing that as a prop or expecting it as a prop. So on close, we want to make that optional because we don't want to force people to use it. And then this is going to be something called a prop function from Qwik. So we're going to say import the type of from builder from Qwik. We want to grab the prop function, which is a generic. And this is a little bit of boilerplate. Don't worry about doing this if you don't care about type definitions, but that's what it should look like. So this is going to be a function that returns void. And then we just need to know if this was passed in, when to execute it. And because we have this tracker that tracks the state of the dialog component itself, we can basically trigger it at the appropriate time. So when the dialog closes, we can just go ahead and say, hey, if this is defined, and execute it. So this is, well, I guess I need to actually use it. So we'll pull that out of the props. We know that's a function. And then we have this sort of short circuit evaluation that says this has to be Boolean before we move on to the next side. And if it's truthy, so if it is defined, then we'll actually execute it. It's essentially the same as doing, let's see, if on close. There. It's the same. It's basically the same syntax. In case you haven't seen it, it's just a short circuit evaluation. So we'll do that, close that. Now let's see if I got this right. I toggle that to open it. We hit escape, should trigger that event. And then if I click it again, it works. Perfect. So now the parent is communicating to the child whether the state should be open or not programmatically. And the child is communicating or providing an API for the parent to know when it closes. Okay, and since we have that, I'd say the dialog component is in pretty good shape. Hopefully, yeah, you can see that it's a little bit more robust than the built-in dialog element, but I like the API for this a little bit better and a little bit more consistent UI. So I'm gonna call that done. And then, yeah, here we're just going to do something like programmatically open it. I don't think we're actually, yeah, we'll leave this button here, and we're gonna have this button say, show me. And then this is going to be the image eventually. So what's the complaint here? Oh, so it's just complaining that this is returning a value. So I guess what we can do is just have this be, yeah, any should be fine. It can either be void or it can return something. Not a problem. Okay, we'll close that. And then next we're going to work on actually generating the image. I'm gonna clean this up a bit. There we go. All right, so the image will go here. This will be a button that shows us the dialog component, and yeah, we'll move on from there. So the next thing to focus on is actually generating the image by making an HTTP request to OpenAI. So we will programmatically open the dialog when the API request is being sent and have some sort of loading spinner. And then when the image is completed or we get the URL back, then we can put the image and in the dialog and render it. And we'll probably still need this button, but I think what we're actually going to do is we'll have to send some data or make an HTTP request. So it makes sense for us to, once again, reach for a form. We'll have an action, and then we can just reuse this button here, but instead of having a click submit handler, we'll probably just leave this as the submit button. So type equals submit. And now instead of having the button be responsible for controlling the dialog, we'll have the form submission kind of be responsible for that. So we'll say on submit. It's going to do something. Once again, we're going to follow this pattern where we'll define the image generation submit handler here. So on submit image or something like that. Then we need to define this. We'll come up here, the dialog state. I think I'm actually going to rename this. Instead of just dialog state, we're going to call this the image state. So it'll control all of the state relating to the image. And instead of just is open, we'll have show dialog, and that should be fine. Now we'll have all of our logic for the image right here. We'll say const on submit image equals, and we have to do this because we're working in Qwik, we have to do this funny $ parentheses syntax for our event handlers. But once we have that, we can say event. And of course, TypeScript is going to complain because this needs to be a submit event. And we need to do something when we submit this. So similar to what we did with the last submit handler is we want to make an HTTP request to some endpoint and get in response the image URL. Now, if we leave the action undefined here, it's going to submit to the current URL, which is not really what we want because we already have the post handler or middleware for this route. So I think what we're going to do is create a new route that's going to be dedicated to handling the logic for creating images. So to create a new API endpoint, we can create a new file, put it at, let's say, AI image / index.js. That should be fine. And then similar to this on post request, well, I'm just going to even copy all this. So on post all the way down to here, and we'll just put that in here. So this is no longer the correct syntax, and we don't want on post. I think for generating an image, we're just going to use a GET request instead. And then I need to convert this from a TypeScript type definition, at type, to a JS docs one because I am switching things up. Nope, import, and we want from Qwik City, from Qwik City, we want that request handler. Perfect. Now, what do we not need here? We are not going to be streaming the response because this is just going to generate an image and send it all at once, so we don't need any of that. We will still need the OpenAI API keys. We will probably not be sending form data because we won't have a request body. We will need a prompt probably at some point, but we'll come back to that part. And then the body, the request, that all looks mostly the same. Once again, we're not using streaming, so we don't need these reader things. Don't need all of this. I think we're just going to end up with a body and passing that back to the response. So move that in, and then we'll get rid of that. And instead of sending a new response as a stream, we'll send something. For now, we'll just send it as text. So I'm going to block this stuff out and see if we can get started with just saying console log on get AI image. Cool. Now the other thing we're going to want to do here is probably receive some data about the image, because after all, when I submit this form, I kind of want the image to represent what's going on in the image. So I'm going to need to have access to both of the opponents, because I basically want the user to define who the opponents are, and then I want to show an image of them fighting, and ideally know who the winner is as well. So what we'll do is we have to send that data along with this request when we submit this form. So how do we do that? Well, we can do that with inputs, and of course, we don't need to actually show these inputs. We can just have empty inputs that sort of bind to whatever this data is. So how we're going to do that is actually maintain some state around who these opponents are and what their values are. So as a user types, it sort of keeps track of that, and then we can also include that information when we submit this form. Hopefully that makes sense. It will make more sense in a moment. So we'll have the state, and then I think what we can do is just have like opponent 1 is something, and opponent 2 is something. We combine those values. For now, I'm going to actually steal them from here. Put a pirate, and then a ninja. There we go. And then of course we'll replace these with state.opponent1 and opponent2. So that should instantiate them as it was. Great. Now we also need to update the state when this changes. So this could be a pirate or a dragon or something. And we want to know when this changes, keep track of that in memory so that we can also apply it to our other form. We're going to say, I'm gonna fix these up a little bit. I'm going to say burp, 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 doot, 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 doot. That all looks good. Class, great. And that looks good. Okay, actually I can do that still. We can say on input, then we're going to create a function, and we'll just do this one inline, I think is fine. That takes the event and sets the state dot opponent one equals the event dot target dot value. And it's going to complain because target may be undefined, which is not going to be the case, but that should be fine. It's saying that event value doesn't exist on event target, but that will be the case because the event will be on the input anyway. So I think this should be fine. And just one more change here. This needs to be opponent 2. So down here, let's see if this is working. So let's say this one. We're going to pretend that this is also in here, and we'll just leave that. I don't think we need that. I don't think we need this. We really just want that value. Okay. So if we say a ninja, and this is going to be a dragon. Great. So now we're seeing that we have the data binding happening between the text and the state in memory, and then we're applying that same information to the form down here. Now, the cool thing about this form is that we actually don't need to be using these fancy inputs. We don't need a visual input. We can just use a regular input that does not have a label. And we're actually going to say, sure, opponent 1, opponent 2. I guess I could leave that. We're going to say that that this input is actually of type hidden. So you won't actually see it. And it is going to be required, just so that we have it there for sure. Shouldn't be a problem, but you never know. And I think that's all we need for that. So we can make a copy, and we'll rename this one to opponent 1. And then I think we also just need one more. Let's put that in line. One more, and that's going to be for the winner. So this is winner. Okay, so this is kind of nice because then once again, we can just rely on our JS form submit logic to handle this information. And because we're using HTML, it can be just declarative to include everything that we need in the markup without having to add that information in the JavaScript, which is kind of nice. I kind of like it that way. To get this to work, of course, we have to set our form action to the right location. And we want to submit to our /AI-image route. We don't need to set the method because, as we said before, it's going to work with a GET request. And when this form is submitted, it should send the value of this input, or the name and value of this input, and this input, and this input when it's submitted. So let's see what that looks like. Looks fine. I think I do want to add some conditional logic, so it only shows when we have an actual winner. So we'll say if state.winner, and we'll throw that in parentheses, and then we'll come down here and close that up. So only show it when there is a winner, and then we'll do on submit image. So the way this is going to work is essentially we want to reuse our JS submit form. So we're going to do something similar to this. We're going to do something like that. I think I'm going to want to have some sort of loading state to open the dialog and also show some sort of spinner that something's happening. So first we have this await keyword. So we're going to mark this as async. Then we're going to want to have some sort of loading state. So is loading is going to be false. And we obviously want to set that before. So we're going to say image state dot show dialog is going to be true, so that when we submit this form, we're going to immediately show this dialog, and we are going to set the is loading to true. When this is complete, we can leave the dialog open because we obviously don't want to close the dialog right when the image is generated, but we do want to set image state.isLoading to false. Now we need access to this form in order to submit it. So we'll say const form is going to equal the event.target, and then it's complaining because it doesn't know that that's an HTML form. So we're going to say as HTML form element. Okay, that fixes that. And let's just start with this, right? We have some sort of loading state. Let's maybe log the response or something. Console log response, response when it comes back. And we want to work on this side next. So let's just see if this is even working. Well, it's not going to show because we don't have a winner. So for now, I guess I'm going to start the state with a winner so that we just know. We're going to say, I like ninjas better. So let's do the ninja is the winner. Okay, so let's hit that button. Let's see. We got something kind of working. We are going to our /AI image. It looks like that's running, but we're not preventing the default behavior. And that is on me because I didn't prevent the default behavior. So you guys were hopefully yelling at me about that. So let's do this. Here we go. We want to prevent default on submit, and then we want to submit it. And that I think is not a real problem. That's a fake problem. Okay, let's go back. Let's reload. Let's show me. That fixed it. Great. That popped open the dialog. That gave us the response. If we look at the network, we did get our stream back as text, and we can see that our data is being sent. So we have, let's see, the payload. Opponent 1 is a pirate, opponent 2 is a ninja, and the winner is a ninja. I think that's probably okay, except that we are actually, when we determine the winner, we are receiving it back as opponent 1 or opponent 2, not the text of the winner. So that's fine. I'm just going to set the winner manually. So we have, here we go. And I said, yeah, opponent 2. Cool. So that's the data I want to send, right? Great. Now we're going to, once again, generate the logic for the backend to make the HTTP request to OpenAI and generate the prompt for us and get the response. Okay, so similar to the previous version, let's see, we do need a prompt template, which we had generated before with const prompt template. It's going to equal new prompt template, which hopefully will import from LangChain. Great. And that is going to take a template, which is a string. I think in this case, I don't need a very large template, so I'm just going to do it inline. And we're going to say basically a parameterized opponent 1, and opponent 2 in a battle to the death, or something like that. And then we have to put our input variables, of course, which, as we did last time, were opponent 1 and opponent 2. So that when we get here, we got this working. We're going to pull out our API key from the environment variables. We are going to generate our prompt. However, the question is, where is opponent 1 and opponent 2 coming from? And when we sent that request before, we can see that it's coming in the query string parameters. So we have them in the payload there, but if we look at the headers, we see that the URL it's submitting to is that AI image ? And then we have our parameters as query string parameters. So we have to pull that out of the URL, which we can do in Qwik quite easily. We can say const we're going to destructure opponent 1 and opponent 2 and the winner that we had. We're going to pull those out of the request event dot query. So that should give us those values. I think as it stands right now, well, with this prompt, we're not actually using the winner. So we'll just leave that out for now. That should be fine. Opponent 1 and opponent 2. And then we generate our prompt by passing in the opponent 1 and opponent 2 variables. And then we need to start setting up the body and the requests. So we are going to go back to platform.openai.com. We'll land on the overview, that's fine. And we want to go to the API reference one more time. And here in the reference, we can see that we have something around images, and we can see that there's creating images or editing or variations. Now we're just going to be generating an image. So we can see that creating an image, this is the information that we want. This is an example. So I'm going to grab this URL and I'm going to replace our fetch request here. So we're going to do that. And we're going to replace the URL, images generation. Now I'm also going to set up the body of the request. And we'll see that in the body of the request, the only thing that we have to provide is the prompt. We can put the number of images and the size in the response format and the user, but I think I'm just interested in the prompt and probably maybe the size we'll get to, which can be any of these three. So I think I'm going to stick with a medium size because I don't think I want the image to take up such a big area. So what we need is essentially none of this. We do need a prompt, which we are providing with the prompt. And we need the size, which we copied, or I copied, as 512 by 512. So with that, we should get something back. And because we're not asking for a stream, the default return value or the body of the response from OpenAI is going to be JSON. So I'm going to say after this request comes back, we're going to grab the response and just grab the response.json method off of it so that this is no longer the response object, but this is actually the data that comes back. We'll just say const results is equal to response.json. So use that there, and this should have been await response.json. So we get that back and we'll log the results. So let's look at what we've got. Yeah, that's predetermined. So we're going to hit show me, and then in our results, we get some sort of error message. Oh, there we go. There's my result. Okay, so importing from LangChain is deprecated. Okay, that's kind of an old message. Essentially, this prompt template should be importing from prompts. Okay, and I think, do I have that here as well? Nope, that was fixed. Okay, great. So the interesting thing is not that error or warning, is this result. We get an object that contains data inside of which there's one item that has the URL. So let's see what happens when we take this URL and open it. And we get something kind of weird. Looks like two wasps fighting to the death, not necessarily a pirate and a ninja. I'm not sure, but that's kind of what happens with these AI generated images. It's very bizarre. I think what I might do is let's also log the prompt just to do a little sanity check. But since we have that information, I think what we'll also do, we know what this result is going to look like. It should get the results back, and then the data property, and then the first item, and then the URL off of that. Or rather, we can probably just respond with this image object. So we want to send some JSON. We can put it in the body here. I think I don't necessarily even need this response object. I'm just going to use the alternate format, which is to pass a status code and then the data. So I'm going to pass a status code of 200, and then the data is going to be json.stringify, because we don't want to pass an object, or we do want to pass an object, but not as an object. We want to pass it as a string. And we're going to pass the results.data, and then we want to send the first item in that data. Once again, that's going to represent the results and then data and then the first item in that data. So that should send this sort of image object containing the URL. Let's do this. Let's say show me, and then that should now come back with the response eventually. There it is. And we're going to grab this guy all the way to the end. And what do we get this time? Very bizarre that we're getting like insects. So what is my prompt? Undefined and undefined in a battle to the death. Awesome. That makes sense that we're getting something kind of weird. So what is happening here? We are not getting the correct opponent 1 and opponent 2. Those are undefined. So let's see, instead of logging the prompt, let's log opponent 1 and opponent 2 and see what the heck is happening there. I'm also going to log the request event beforehand. So console.log the request event, and let's see. Okay, one more time, hit that. That should get us a bunch of information, and we do see undefined and undefined despite the fact that we are sending that information. So where is that existing? Okay, I see what the problem is. As a result, the query is not an object. It is a URL search params. So we actually have to treat that slightly differently. It should not be destructured. We can say something like opponent 1 and opponent 2 equals event.query.get, and I'm going to just copy that. There you go. Const that. Okay, we'll copy this. Do that. We don't need you. I think that should hopefully work now. So let's try that one more time. We're going to see down here. We do get a pirate and a ninja. Great. And the response here should now have an image that makes way more sense, or at least somewhat closer to what we are hoping for.
Nice.
Great. We have a pirate and a ninja in a battle to the death. Okay, great. Let's just get that set up and then we'll focus on the style. So we've got this URL and we essentially want to put that into an image, right? So I think we've got all that working. Okay, so just make sure this is looking good. We get the request information coming in. We set up our prompt. We're actually getting the opponent 1 and opponent 2 back correctly this time. And then we send our fetch requests, brings back that information with the body of our request. And great, we got that. That looks good. Now, for us to use this image URL, we need to do something with it. So let's start with this on image submit. We are getting the response here, which is a response object from that request that we had. So because that's sending JSON back, we can actually do something similar and say const results is going to equal await the response.json. Right, that's going to get us our JSON back. And then we said that the results should be an object containing a URL. So I'm going to use one more property in the image state called URL, and that's going to be an empty string to begin with. And when we get these results back, we're going to set image state.url to the results.url. After all, that will be the image object that we got. Clean that up a little bit. That's looking good. And once we have that, in theory, when that response comes back, we should have the URL in memory in this image state. So that means that what we can do is after this dialog opens, we can do a check here. Do something like image state dot is loading. Then we'll show some sort of loading thing because we don't want to show the image while the state is loading, while it's still generating. Sure, I'll put some text that just says loading. And otherwise, we can say if the image state, if it's not, is loading, then we know we should have the image available. So we can do an image element. Whoops. We can do an image element whose source attribute is going to be the image state.url. And probably should also have some alt text. And we're just going to say something like an epic battle between, and we kind of want the two opponents, and we have access to them with the state, right? We can say state.opponent1 and state.opponent2. Okay, that should generate our image with the URL and an alt text that is helpful for assistive technology users. So let's see what we've got. We have this pre-filled out, which is why there is a winner. We're going to say show me. We should see loading. Okay. And then at some point, this is going to respond, and that's going to generate the image between presumably a pirate and a ninja. Okay. The next thing I want to showcase is this little sort of kind of unreliable system with the images that are actually being generated. So we have some kind of different styles going on. And I think I personally like having something that's a little bit more consistent, but as we determined in previous videos, AI is one of those things that we can't really get consistent. So for example, this is a great example. This is a sort of image that I would probably not want to have in this app. So I think it would make sense to provide something in the prompt that would narrow down a little bit more what we actually want, similar to what we did with the text-based prompts. So we're going to do that once again. And as we did with the text-based prompts, we're going to modify our prompt here. But instead of doing it at the template level or sort of with template modifiers, I think what I'm going to do is just show off how with images, it's kind of funny because you don't actually need to have a coherent sentence. I mean, we do here, but then there's a common practice of just throwing in some extra words that kind of provide some design direction. So for example, we could say cinematic, we could say epic, or we could say high resolution. And those are the ones that I've found that I kind of like the design for. So with that in place, let's see how that ends up modifying our image. So, okay, still kind of quirky, funky, obviously AI generated image, but we're getting a little bit more of a dramatic scene that is what I'm interested in. So let's do one more and see how that works. Okay, cool, kind of interesting. And this is something that, again, I can't really teach you the right way to do it because there is no one right way. You'll learn that there's a couple of magical combination of words that seem to get the job done, but it's a long journey of trial and error to discover what those are. So what I'm going to do is actually do a little bit of a copy paste with some things that you can play around with. So I'm going to copy something into my project here. I'm going to say right here, let's do this copy and paste job. We could probably import this from somewhere else or leave it here, but I basically have a bunch of modifiers here that are just these words that we can use to make our project a little bit more dynamic across different sorts of qualities. So I have a section for like effects, a section for different types of quality we could be going for, different types of format, and different types of style. So the idea here is we have one very long array with just the modifiers that we want to include, not commented out or valid, and everything else commented out. So you can use any sort of combination that you want. Again, this is probably something that's easier for you to just copy and paste from the GitHub repo or from the project itself, but I want to show that. So we have this array, and essentially what I'm going to do here is instead of having these hard-coded in here, I'm going to just take this mods array and just join with separating comma space. So then it'll take whatever words are in here that are not commented out, and it will add that to the end of our project. So if I want, let's see, we could do, how about instead of cinematic, we did like anime, right? Oops, we need a comma there. There you go. I guess some of these are missing commas, but easy enough to fix. We can take that, and now let's see how this image is going to look different. Okay, see, we did what did we do? Cartoon or anime? Yeah, kind of gets us there. And just by having that, again, it leaves a little bit less guessing and interpretation for the AI image generation to do, a little bit more direction from our side. I'm not really sure what to do about the funky faces, but that's kind of the nature of these AI generated images at the moment. And to be honest, it's kind of cool. So yeah, I don't really mind it. But I do prefer cinematic over anime. So we'll leave that in and go back to a different style. Yeah, much better. Cool. Okay. So with that set up, I'm going to start moving this video or this section to a more finished state. So I'm going to do a little bit of polish. Let's see. We're going to remove the pre-existing winner as well as opponents. And I think what I'm going to do is add another component that's going to kind of be a little bit helpful for us, because I don't love that when we hit that image generation thing, we saw the text loading. I think I'd like to have a little bit of a loading spinner. So I'm going to do that with an SVG, and I'm going to create a component for this. So let's go here and call it svg.jsx. So in this file, what I'm going to do is just go to the input component, copy all of it, paste it in here. I don't think we need this random string. We can get rid of all the props. This should be an SVG element, I think, or SVG element. And this is going to be SVG attributes. That is going to be replaced there. We don't need this random string. We don't need the contents here. And we're just going to have this be an SVG. So this is going to export. Essentially, what I'm going to do is be using the SVG sprite approach. So we're not going to drop in the full contents of an SVG. We're going to be referencing it later, and we're going to be referencing it according to an SVG sprite list. So here is a little trick that I like to, or a little pattern that I like to follow, where I'll have an SVG component, and then I'll have another SVG component exported from the same file. So we're going to have a named export called SVG definitions. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to build this out quickly and then walk through and explain it, I think. Or I'm just gonna start coding it, and then I'll come back and explain what's going on. But a key thing here is we're going to have a object called definitions. And that's going to be an empty object for now. So first thing, let me go with the definitions, and let me just do this part really quick and come back and explain what's going on. Okay, so let's see, let's explain what exactly is going on here. I basically have created a component, doesn't need any props, a component called SVG definitions, and what it is going to render is an SVG tag that is going to be ARIA hidden and basically visually hidden. So no one's actually going to be able to see this, but inside of this SVG, we're going to have these definitions, and we're going to use dangerously set inner HTML because we're going to want to inject raw HTML onto the page inside of these definitions. So these definitions are derived from this object called definitions, and it's basically just going to take the values of that object and turn it into array, and then join that array without any spaces in between. So what does that actually do? Well, what we need to do is actually provide some SVGs in these definitions. So what I'll do is go to this website called Icons, which I really like if you need some copy and paste SVGs. And let's do a search for, I don't know, Spinner. And I'll just find one that I like. So let's maybe do this little dot guy. I'm going to click on that, and then I'm going to copy the SVG by clicking here. Oh no, sorry. What I actually want is this SVG symbol. So that's very important. We don't want the SVG, we want the SVG symbol. Now, if we go to these definitions, I can enter this with having something colon, and then the value of this SVG symbol here. So what I'm going to do, what we essentially end up with is an SVG symbol that can be reused throughout the page without necessarily injecting the SVG values into the page. That's going to make sense in a moment. But with this symbol, I'm going to use this ID. I'm going to call this something like icon-spinner. And then I'm also going to provide that as the key in this object. So now we have the key icon spinner and the value set to the symbol. And so when this component is generated, it's going to create a definition containing this symbol in it, which can be referenced via the ID here. So we're going to put this on the page somewhere. We only need it one place, and that is going to be in the root of our document. So I'm going to import it here. I'm going to import something from /components/svg.jsx, and I'm going to import the SVG definitions. Now, this is going to be a component that we can put anywhere. I like to put it somewhere near the end of the body because that's fine. And I guess this can be self-closing, right? There we go. Okay, so let's see what this actually does. In my markup, as I look inside of the body, way down at the bottom somewhere, I guess not so far down at the bottom, we have this SVG that contains these definitions that has this symbol, which is what we put there. Now, once this symbol is here with an ID, we can use a different syntax to reference this ID and essentially grab the contents of this SVG and inject it onto the page. So I am going to do that next, and we do that with another syntax where we essentially have an SVG, and inside of that SVG, we have this tag called use. So we're going to essentially use an SVG symbol inside of the SVG. Hopefully that's not too esoteric, but it'll make sense as we sort of build this out. So this use tag, it needs to have an href. So I'm just going to show this off right now. We can do that icon spinner to reference it. And actually this can just be self-closing itself. There you go. So now let's actually use this SVG, or let's use this component. I'm going to go here, copy it, paste it. We're going to replace this with the SVG, make that available. And then in my homepage, I'm going to import that as SVG, and I'm going to use it. So let's just throw that onto the page somewhere without conditional rendering. So we're going to do SVG and close that. Oh, looks like I got the syntax a little bit wrong. I am missing, there you go. It needs to be pound and then the ID. And there we go, just using that. It's very, very little markup. So that's pretty nice to have just the markup of this component be as small as it can be. And the nice thing here is we can also reuse this. So I can have several of these on the page, and it keeps the markup nice and slim. So of course, we do want to make this dynamic, so it's not just taking that hard-coded value as the icon spinner. We want to provide that as one of the props. So what I'm going to do here is do my same little props destructuring thing. I'm going to put these props on the SVG itself, props, and then we want to provide a property for this href. So we're going to say somewhere in here, don't need you, somewhere in here, we're going to have an href attribute. And that is going to be, well, this is a nice thing here. I don't want people to have to memorize what this is. I want them to automatically know which names are available based on the properties here. And we can do that with key of definitions, definitions. And once we have that, we can take the href out of the props and we can place it in here. So that is a required property, which means this is now going to be squiggly, but if we control space, we see the recommended or the auto suggest for href. And if we control space again, we can see that it's recommending icon spinner out of the list of available options. So now with that in place, we still have something a little bit off because once again, I missed that thing. This should have the pound in front of it once again. So I'm just going to do it this way. probably a couple of different ways we can do that, but I kind of like automatically including the pound for anyone, so they don't have to include it here. Now that's all fine and good for getting it onto the page, but there's a couple other things that we want to account for when we're dealing with visual elements that we probably want to account for, like assistive technology. So what we'll do is we're going to come to our SVG component. I'm going to drop these props onto a separate line. And I'm going to say that first of all, I want to probably provide some sort of alternate text for this SVG. So you can do that in a number of ways with SVGs, but I find that the most reliable is just having some text there along with it. So I think what we're going to do is probably actually wrap this in a fragment, and then we'll have some text here that's just pretty much invisible. So I want to have a prop that is required, that is going to be a label, it's a type of string. And then inside of this span, we're going to put this label, which we are going to pull off of the props here. Or maybe instead of label, we'll actually treat this a little bit more like an image and call it an alt text. Now inside of my unique styles, or the styles that we imported at the beginning of the project, I do have a special class called visually hidden. So that means when we put this on the page, the span will be there, and this will provide some sort of textual content in place of this label, but it won't be visible. I mean, right now it's not visible because you can't, there actually isn't any text in there, but it has all of these styles. So if you did not import my styles that generate some of this stuff, I would encourage you to look into this visually hidden class. It's pretty helpful. But this allows us to go back here and say that our SVG spinner is going to have an alt text of loading. Cool, and that's really nice for assistive technology, although it will be ignored or it will be not visible, but it will be captured by assistive technology. Now we have to kind of do the same for this SVG, because we want the SVG visible to sighted users, but not necessarily visible to assistive technology. And we can do that easily by just marking this SVG as having a role of presentation. Okay, now one more thing to finish up with this guy before I'm done is this is kind of the default styles for an SVG, and I would really like this to inherit from the font size wherever it is used. And I basically also have some styles built into my global styles that account for that if we have the style or the class of icon applied to this SVG. Now, I don't necessarily want to apply the class of icon to every SVG because maybe I'm not using an icon, maybe I'm using some sort of logo. So what I like to do is also have, in addition to the href, an icon attribute. And that is going to match exactly what the href is. They're basically going to be identical. However, it's going to be an alternative option where you basically can treat it as the same thing, but if the icon is present in place of href, then we'll add another class of icon. So what we'll do is have a class equal, and in this case with Qwik, we can use an object style representation for the class names. And we can say the icon class will only be applied if icon is truthy, so if it's essentially defined. And then I also want to add the class of whatever the icon name is in case we want to have some sort of special, basically want to append this class name if it's being used. So we're going to have a dynamic property that is a string, which takes in that icon value or the property value. And we're also going to basically set that only if it's truthy. So now we'll append the class of icon and whatever the icon identifier is when it's used. So now what we can do is instead of using href, I want to use icon. Okay. Now we have something, a little bit of a typo there. We accounted for the classes, but not the actual href. So this is basically just going to be either use the href value or use the icon value, since they're essentially going to be the same thing. If we come back here, now we can see, great, that icon now looks a lot more, or the SVG now is in the right size and shape that I want it based on the font size. So the last thing to fix here is the actual use of this. It's going to complain because we are providing an icon, but we're no longer providing the href attribute. So we have to do a little bit of finagling with TypeScript to get this to work, where we're basically going to say, this component takes some properties that include anything that is an SVG attribute, as well as an alt attribute or an alt prop. And then we also want to combine this. I'm actually going to close this object off here, so it's only the alt is there. And I'm going to create a new object. And this is going to be, well, I'm not going to get too far into it because TypeScript, that's a little bit outside of the scope of this project. But essentially, we're going to create a union. I'm going to create two objects that include the href and the icon. And then it's going to have icon question mark as an optional property that is never used. And this one is going to be the href. And this is going to be a union between these two. So now I think we can get rid of this guy, and that should do it. And basically this syntax is saying, I want the properties to be a combination of SVG attributes, an object here that has to have an alt attribute, and then the combination of a union between these two, which is basically one object that always is going to have an href and a option or never have an icon attribute, or an object that always is going to have an icon attribute but never have the href attribute. And this allows us to basically solve that, where if icon is defined, we cannot have an href equals test or whatever. If href is defined, then we do not need the icon, although this should have been complaining because of the wrong type. There we go. And if we don't have either, then the SVG is going to complain. So it's a nice way to just ensure that your team is kind of doing things, you're providing the best help to your team members. So that is the SVG component. I really like it. Hopefully this was helpful to you, despite the fact that it's not specifically a Qwik or AI sort of thing. We're just kind of having some fun. But with that in place, we can get rid of that, and we can go down and replace this loading state and basically say, hey, if you don't have that, or rather if the image state is loading, then we're going to show this little spinner. It's going to have the alt text of loading. It's going to show that it's a spinner. I'm going to give this a nice big size too. So we're going to use some Tailwind classes to say this is going to be text 8XL, makes it a nice easy way to control the size. And then since we already have this loader here, there's another spot that I think it would be helpful. And that is here. Instead of saying when the button is, or when the original button is loading, having this submit text, we can actually just have this spinner here, and we're going to give this, yeah, an alt text of loading. Sure. Okay, last little thing I think I need to do is probably put some space between this form and the articles. I'm gonna just go here and say class equal, we'll do the same margin top of 4. There we go. Okay, let's see how we got that. Maybe a first try situation, let's hope. We reload, we're gonna say a battle between a dragon and a chimera, and we're gonna submit that. Check out the network. Okay, cool. We get response, we get the chimera, awesome. And then we get this button that shows us. So we're gonna say, show me. My spinner is working, it's looking pretty good. I think, is that right? Wow, heck yeah, that's so sweet. Awesome. I think, do I have something? Let's see. Yeah, I feel like this might be test. Oops. That SVG, that loader didn't look quite right. So I'm going to put this just inside of there. And let's see what we've got. Open that. Yeah, so feels like this is, the SVG itself is fine. No, it's not, because we have overridden the text, or the class, I mean. Okay, I see what happened. That's it, right? Up. There we go. Okay, that's in the right place. Let's open up this SVG. I am just missing, where is it? Essentially what's happening here is when we add a class to the props, it overwrites the class that we have here. So I'm just gonna make this simple and take class out of there. And of course we can't use the name class. So let's do class as class name. That's the name of my variable now. And we can just put that here. Well, the new class name is, yeah, if it's defined, sure, same thing. Okay, try this again. Let's do an angry raccoon versus a disgruntled possum. I wonder if I spelled that right. The raccoon, okay, because they're typically larger, stronger, and more aggressive. Sure, show me. Yeah, all right. Kind of looks like two raccoons. Also looks like we still have that class wrong. So let's see here. I'm gonna copy you. We're gonna get rid of this and everything else inside. And toggle is, just make that a string. Gonna set this open. Just set that to open. And we don't need that. Okay. Let's see what's going on here. Am I not showing it? Where's my dialog? Open equals true. Okay. Toggle equals, that should be working. Should be open. That's interesting. Okay, where's my dialog? I don't know, but this is not working correctly. Oh, adoy. That's because I'm using the static class name. There you go. And I think that also needs to be a string. Silly me, it was right there in front of my face. Okay, there we go. That's as big as it should be. Perfect. All right, a little bit of fumbling there, but that's okay. We got through it. I can get rid of you. And let's look at this one more time. Okay, let's try this one more time. We're gonna say a chupacabra and Bigfoot. And all right, the spinner's working. That's great. We get that chupacabra. It's like chupacabra is the winner. Great. Now let's see it. All right. I don't see Bigfoot in there, but you know what? That's a pretty decent chupacabra, so we're going to stick with it. Okay. I think that's as far as we need to get today. We didn't cover anything that was particularly new, but hopefully this was a good opportunity for you to get some practice in and re-solidify some of the concepts that we've talked about in the past. And we also got to play around with some interesting application designs around the SVG icons. I really hope that you've been enjoying this series so far, because we are getting close to the end of the application. So in the next videos, we're just going to be focusing on tightening some stuff down, working on security, and eventually launching the project. So if you're looking forward to that and you want to be notified, be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you'll know when the next videos come out. And if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to throw them in the comments section below, and let me know that you are enjoying this series by putting a like on that video. We really appreciate it.